paper has two parts. The first part is a reconsideration of the humanist controversy. And the second part says something about the categories of time and life in Marx's capital. But to begin with, in a way, what seems to be the repressed question here, the main question, which is why we're asking again today the question, how do we stand in relation to the concept of the human today? Because in many ways, I think it's a surprising question to ask again at this point, given the philosophical history of the question, and also in particular, given what one might call the outcome of the discussion about this in France at the end of the 1960s, in particular, about which there was, in a certain respect, a certain amount of consensus, although different interpretations, but some consensus about the outcome of that debate. When in the late 1980s, Jean-Luc Nancy asked an assorted body of French philosophers his famous question, who comes after the subject, in order to produce an overview of contemporary philosophical activity in France. It was firstly, in order to define the philosophical conjuncture of the 1980s as one that had already moved definitively beyond the so-called humanist controversy into some as yet indeterminate but nonetheless definitely post-humanist afterwards. A post-humanist afterwards that was in no way a post-human afterwards. So I want to draw a strong distinction between the notion of post-humanism registering in some sense the redundancy of the humanist question and the notion of the post-human. Since it seems to me that the concept of the post-human is the humanist category par excellence. I don't think you can have a more humanist category than a post-human. Post-human is really just the imagined future of historicized humanism. So every post-human is just a phantasmatic projection of the next human. So the post-human is part of humanism. Post-humanism is after humanism and consequently after the post-human. Nonetheless, at the same time as Nancy was definitively attempting to persuade his readers that the humanist controversy was definitively past, one reason he was doing it was because of the first stirrings of a return to classically modern humanism in the French philosophical scene. In the book by Luc Ferry and Alain Renaud, which in a way perversely introduced Habermasianism into France in the mid-1980s. In the book French Philosophy of the 60s, subtitled An Essay on Anti-Humanism. This was, if you like, the attack, the reaction against anti-humanism. This return, Nancy remarked at the time, was one that stemmed from what he called the forgetting of philosophy. This was, if you like, an active forgetting of a certain philosophical history, which of course Luc Ferry continues to practice. Ironically, of course, such an active forgetting, if this is what it is, positions Ferry's humanism practically and ironically in precisely that Nietzschean mode which he takes humanism to be opposing. So I think it's a sign of the definitive passing of humanism as a philosophical position in France, that even its return appears as a form of post-humanism, because you can only be a humanist after the humanist controversy in a Nietzschean mode. You just affirm humanism. But the affirmation of humanism is, if you like, the philosophical undercutting of humanism. So the Habermasianism turns out to be a kind of empty vessel in some ways. What this reminds us of course, is two things. Firstly, that ideological concepts are not dispelled by philosophical critique. humanism is, of course, an ideological concept par excellence. It's the very definition of an ideological concept. In the wake of Kant's concept of transcendental illusion, that ideological concepts are not dispelled by critique. If they were dispelled by critique, then they would have no actuality at the level of their social determination. Secondly, and as a consequence of the fact that ideological concepts are not dispelled by critique, this means that philosophical concepts are intrinsically and dialectically double-coded, which means that all philosophical concepts appear simultaneously as proto-scientific concepts and as rhetorical, political, or ideological concepts. So despite Althusser's attempt to turn that into two kinds of concept, rather what I would suggest is that's a contradiction between the philosophical and the ideological function of all philosophical concepts. It's internal to all those concepts. And the human, as I've said, is a rhetorical and ideological concept par excellence. As Boris pointed out, paradigmatically, in its Janus space, in its reciprocal differentiation from the divinity of the pure intelligence, rationality, or spirit on the one hand, and the sensuous finitude of animality or living nature on the other. The synthetic and inherently contradictory concept of the rational animal, like, is the summary of that double-facedness. So all humanisms take two forms. Either they play one side of these two concepts off against the other. Either they play off spirit, intelligence, rationality against animality, or they play off the concept, for example, of the human animal. They play off animality against intelligence, spirit, and rationality. Or finally, the only other alternative, which is in a way the Kantian Lacanian alternative, is that they play off the contradiction, the intrinsic contradiction between the two against the others. They define the human as tragically moral because constitutively contradictory. What this means is that what humanism means in any particular moment in the philosophical debate is to a large part determined by what one is arguing against. So to put it another way, there is no non-conjunctural humanism, however philosophical it is and how much you rethink it, because humanism is a political and ideological concept. Consequently, since today there is such a complex multiplicity of positions on what the human is, which we've heard a few today already, which is in part an interesting consequence, I think, of the internationalization of intellectual debate. We can no longer have the comfort of our ignorance of debates elsewhere. This means that if one were to attempt some philosophically and ideologically effective refoundation of the concept of the human today, it would have to be as correspondingly complicated as the multitude of philosophical positions against which it would have to argue and through which it would have to constitute itself in opposition. Now, returning to the French debate, I think there's two things that remain of interest about the 1960s debate in France. The first is the fact that it took place within a problematic that completely mortgaged the concept of the human to the philosophical concept of the subject. And the second is to do with its geopolitical periodicity. Its very bounded character, the fact that the debate effectively took place from 1945 to 1968, which is in some sense a very definitive period in French and other intellectual histories. In other words, from Sartre's little pamphlet on existentialism and humanism in 1945 at the outset of the post-war in Europe, which of course quickly became the Cold War, which made the debates a little more complicated, to Derrida's essay called The Ends of Man, which was very self-consciously dated as 12 May 1968, at the end of the published version of the text. Now, in the first of these two cases, what we might call the philosophical victory of theoretical anti-humanism no longer, I think, has quite the meaning that it needed to have at the time in 1968. And I take this victory of theoretical anti-humanism, by the way, to be summed up in three texts, written serially in 1966, 1967, and 1968, which is the last two chapters of Foucault's Order of Things, the chapters on man and his doubles and the human sciences. Althusser's unfinished and only posthumously published book on the humanist controversy from 1967, and Derrida's essay from 1968. In the second case, an interesting question I think is raised by analogy, which in a way is the question of this event, which is the question of the geopolitical meaning of a debate about the production of humanity that takes place after 1989, because in a way, I think we have to re-periodize the humanist debate. In the humanist debate in France ran from 1965 to 1968. Essentially, from 1968 to 1989, we merely have the period of the reception and internationalization of the French debate. The French debate is taken into other philosophical cultures and reflected. After 89, which is like the beginning of a new geopolitical period, that changes the geopolitical terms of the humanist debate in a way that I'll come back to. So in a way, this, you could sum up, if you like, the question that's being asked today in this event, if we mimic the question that Derrida took himself to be asked in New York in 1968, which was, where is France as concerned man? In a way, this event could really be structured around the question, where is Russia as concerns man after 1989? This is a kind of interesting debate, I think. The fact that the answer to this question, which is proposed by the Symposium, namely between biopolitics and neohumanism, is actually located in the 1920s. It tells us a great deal about the way that that question is being interpreted in Moscow in 2014. In other words, does it suggest, for example, that Russia, the signifier Russia here is to be understood in the sense of Derrida's concept of philosophical nationalities, Russia as a signifier of a particular philosophical nationality. Does Russia solely reside in the past as a philosophical nationality? Right? Does it solely reside in the heroic past of the 1920s and the mystical past of the late 19th century, such that one might say Russia as a philosophical signifier is in kind of exile in the present, of course along with a lot of other people, trying to renew itself through new sets of relations to these two specific pasts. Because in a way, a lot of the debates about the reception of the avant-garde seem to take the form of a debate about whether you can in some way reduce it to a narrative of continuity with 19th century mysticism. In a way, this is I'm afraid, is probably Boris's historically unfortunate role. Since it's not here, we can say this. And the primary signifier of that move is to rename the Soviet avant-garde as the Russian avant-garde. Or does the Russian avant-garde of the 1920s constitute a definitive break in Russian philosophical history, such that it's a mistake to talk about such a thing as the Russian avant-garde in the 1920s? Because to call the Russian, the avant-garde of the 1920s Russian is to negate its Soviet character in both the retrospective and prospective name of new nationalisms. So the question would be, in some sense, can Russia as a philosophical signifier renew itself through some new relation to that period and that thought? Or more deeply, what are the conditions of possibility for such a renewal? other words, what would be the historical conditions of possibility for such a union? Or is this a kind of fruitless task, historically speaking? Is it a kind of whistling in the wind? Are we whistling in the wind? Shall we collectively whistle in the wind? Okay, the reason that the philosophical victory of theoretical anti-humanism no longer seems to have the meaning that it appeared to have at the end of the 60s concerns first and foremost a change in the philosophical status of the concept of the subject, to which accounts of the human became attached in the modern period around about the end of the 18th century. And this change, which is in a way a retroactive change in the reception of French philosophy in the 1960s, can be summed up in the idea, which is increasingly acknowledged in the more serious literature, that while structuralism may have dispensed with the metaphysical illusion of the subject as a special kind of thing, thinking or otherwise, thinking matter, this would be the Ilian-Kantian classical version, classical Cartesian version, a dispensing that was in fact already diagnosed by Kant in the very same text in which he produced the philosophical concept of the subject for the first time in 1781. In the parallelisms of pure reason, in the critique of pure reason, essentially structuralism is a positivistic replaying of the parallelisms of pure reason in Kant. If structuralism did that, if structuralism dispelled that metaphysical illusion, nonetheless, it's increasingly acknowledged that structuralism itself is indeed a philosophy or a theory of the subject, and that equivocation is important in philosophy theory, simply of a different non-metaphysical kind. So the first thing to acknowledge is that structuralism is a philosophy of the subject, as all serious students of the concept have always maintained. The philosophy theory equivocation is important. If we think, for example, of Badiou's book Theory of the Subject, which is the transcript of the seminars from the end of the 70s, it's clear, I think, that Badiou's theory of the subject is very much a theory of the subject. It's not a philosophy of the subject. One thing that I want to suggest is that the equivocation between philosophy and theory, which is partly a legacy of the 1960s, corresponds within the humanist debate to an equivocation between the terms humanity and the human. So I want to identify the term humanity with philosophy as in some sense the problematic category. And I want to identify the phrase the human with theory, and to disengage the concept of the human from all possible humanisms. While humanity, the term humanity, is always in some sense a metaphysical specification, the term the human is the merely linguistic substantialization or an adjectival quality that remains open. Indeed, open itself to re-ontologization as being open as it is in Agamben. But I would like to avoid the re-ontologization of openness that you find there. So within this revised structure, the subject appears as both a formal and an existential concept. And it appears as a concept in which there is a disjunction between its formal and its existential meanings. So if we think of the classical structuralist concept of the subject, in an essay like Jacques Amilaire's The Action and Structure, the subject becomes something like the name, the empty place of the action of a structure which cannot remain unnamed. As such, it can be conceptually dissociated from any necessary relation to the human. So although structuralism remains a theory of the subject, it dissociates the question of the human from the question of the subject at the level of, if you like, its analytical and conceptual relations, while nonetheless leaving it in play as a relevant category, indeed a necessary category, in relation to the thinking of the human, category that is necessary but not analytically related to the human. It's symptomatic that the majority of the responses to Nancé's question about who comes after the subject in the expanded book-length version of that collection in 1991 precisely concerned subjects of various different philosophical sorts. So if you look at the essays by Ballard, by Cadieu, by Decoux, by Granel, they're all about subjects. So the answer to the question who comes after the subject turns out to be that subjects in the plural are what come after the subject. It's a rarefied metaphysical category. You can dispense with the subject, you can't dispense with subjects. Philosophically, what's happened in the meantime is that the philological history of philosophical concept of the subject has been completely rewritten. And in this movement, the notion of the human has become cut adrift philosophically from the notion of the subject. So having been associated with the anthropologization of a series of versions of the concept of the subject, Kant, Hegel, early Marx, Searle, the relations of the concept of the human to what we now use philosophically as concepts of subjects and subjectivation remain radically unclear. In other words, no one has yet re-articulated the relationship between a post-humanist concept of the human and a post-structuralist concept of the subject. However, one consequence of this, for example, is that rather than thinking that the significance of structuralist analysis for history involves the reconceptualization of history as, in Althusser's famous phrase, a process without a subject. This was the kind of mantra of the 70s, right? History is a process without a subject. Rather, on the basis of the structuralist rethinking of the subject, we can say, we would do better to say that history is rather precisely a process that has the unity of a subject, by which is meant history is a process that has the imaginary unity conferred by the necessity to name the empty place of the actions of its structure, or better, the necessity to name the empty place of the structural interactions of its various structures. It's in this sense, of course, that in Marx, capital functions as a self-developing subject, or what in both Volume 1 and Volume 3 of Capital Marx calls an automatic subject. What's interesting is that Marx's notion of capital as an automatic subject is inconsistent with humanist concepts of the subject, which is wholly consistent with a structuralist concept of the subject. Indeed, we could go further and say capital is the subject, which equals the unity of the process, that is the condition of the possibility of history as such in any non-metaphysical or non-theological construal of the collective singularity of history. And history in its modern philosophical sense exists only in the collective singular. There is the history of some empirical historiography is not really history in any conceptually significant sense. As the form of unity that, as the form that gives unity to the process of history, capital is also, of course, the current limit of the collective singularity of history. Furthermore, this necessity to name the empty place, and hence to give unity to the process through the singularity of a name, is that of the condition of the narrative intelligibility of events as the outcome of acts, and hence of the temporal continuity of experience itself. In other words, this, like the necessity that underlies the necessity to name the empty place of the action of structure is basically the transcendental necessity of narrativity. In other words, a narrative concept of event. And that's important for philosophies of event like Badiou's that want to, if you like, to remove all narrative significance from the concept of event. I want to suggest that you can't remove narrative significance event to the point of rendering it absolutely useless. So there's a problem with all of these concepts of event that you find in Badiou and in those of his followers who became things like speculative realists when they tried to de-narrativize the concept of event. What this argument does to the suspended and now orphaned post-metaphysical concept of the human is that it distributes it throughout the network of relations, constituting the structures through which humans are constituted as humans via their relations with other humans in a trans-individual manner. So the unity of the human, in other words, logically speaking, is a distributed unity. It has no, there is no generic essence, there's no essence of any kind. There is the logical continuity of the history of the process of distribution. The distributive unity of such networks of relations desubstantializes the concept of the human and disqualifies the idea of the humanity in the collective singular philosophical discourse. So basically what I want to do is I want to hold on to the concept of history in the collective singular, but take away its grounding in the concept of humanity in the collective singular. So that humanity does not ground history. Humans ground history, humanity does not. In this respect, while the politics of the human remains alive in a theoretically displaced mode, as that of the historical content and modes of unity of social relations, it's hard, if not impossible, to render this politics of the human consistent with any notion of humanism as an ism, since as an ism, it's a form of collective affirmation. You can't collectively affirm the human as such, because there is no human as such. The ism, the collective affirmation of a totalized we that's held together by what Derrida called the uninterrupted metaphysical familiarity, which links the signifier we in philosophy with the signifier we in the expression we men, and the signifier we in the expression the horizon of humanity, is simply incoherent. The collective affirmation of the whom and by whom and against whom, one may ask, for there is no ism that is not part of a set of oppositional political positions. So the answer can only be by one part of humanity against another. Humanists against the inhuman, humanists against the inhumane, humanists against the evil, humanists against the mad, humanists against the religious. It turns out, in other words, that humanism is the name for the ideological legitimation of the disqualification of human status from large amounts of humans. That is, in some sense, the only historical function of the term human in humanism. This difference fractures the complacency of humanism by requiring that humanists must recognize the claim made on the human by all of those they exclude, which means they have to find new grounds for excluding them. So as a collective affirmation or an ism, humanism only makes conceptual sense in relation to some externality. Classically, as I said before, the pure rationality of the divine on the one hand, or the pure animality of the animal on the other. This is why Kojève is in the mainstream of this tradition. But also, we should not forget the third position, which is classically the extraterrestriality of an imagined alien intelligence on another planet in some more consistent science fictional version. And it has to be said that the science fictional version is more consistent than classical humanism. It is this science fictional version to which communism is reduced today as the imaginative aspect of its pure idea by people like Badiou, Zizek, who wish to affirm communism as idea. That's something really you can only do in the genre of science fiction. This has the interesting, and I'm sure inadvertent for Badiou and Zizek, retroactive effect of rendering the Soviet avant-garde of the 1920s as itself politically science fictional. that is to say, wholly other to its own historical actuality, retroactively construed, in other words, from the standpoint of the present. What this means is, for example, that the at the time urgently conjunctural, but nonetheless historico-philosophical political texts of the Russian Revolution, texts such as What is to be done, have become, by virtue of subsequent recent history, literary texts, and possibly science fictional texts. Now, biopolitics and neo-humanism, it seems to me, are far too domesticating categories to grasp the productive externality of the practices of the avant-garde in this period to both there and our present. So essentially, I think only the category that alien really can do justice to the level of externality in a deep historical sense. So as a political, that is to say, an intra-human concept, outside of these exclusionary and generally religious emphasizations of metaphysical essences of the human, the concept of humanism makes no sense. The question of the externality, or the outside from the standpoint of which the human might be totalized, is also that of the question of the limits of every particular humanism. As such, it's intimately connected to the question of geopolitics and the periodicity of humanist controversies, to which, as I've said, I think the French one, in a way, 1945 to 1968, remains the privileged point of reference. One needs to write French, in inverted commas, of course, because it's French in Derrida's sense of philosophical nationality. The debate itself, of course, was also both German and Soviet. German and Soviet, but not Russian, on my analysis. Since it was fueled in large part by Heidegger's 1947 letter on humanism, and includes not only Marcuse's 1948 essay on existentialism, but also, of course, Lukash's orthodox, Stalinist in some way, 1949 essay on existentialism, which is the prelude to, in a way, in some sense, his most grand and overblown analysis, the fantastic analysis of existentialism as the Ash Wednesday of parasitical subjectivism in the destruction of reason, which has enormous power as a fictional text. But this was not the only Soviet element in the Western debate. Insofar as Soviet Marxist humanism was, of course, one of the internal positions of the French Communist Party in the 1960s. And indeed, Soviet Marxist humanism's position within the humanist debate within the French Communist Party, despite Lukash's, if you like, religious depiction of existentialism, positioned Marxist humanism much closer to Christian humanism than it did to existentialism. And I think that that's a position that in many ways explains something of the way the PCF reacted to the events of May 1968. In a sense, May 1968 was too existentialist an occurrence to be recognizable as a political event by the French Communist Party, something from which it has never, of course, recovered. The geopolitical periodicity and historical rather than narrowly political stakes of the French humanist controversy appear most explicitly in the final act, that is to say, Derrida's essay, The End of Man. At the outset of this text, written as a lecture to be delivered in New York in October '68 and dated on its publication, 12th of May, Derrida dates the text as follows. This is a quotation. He dates it, he says, quite precisely from the month of April 1968. It will be recalled that these were the weeks of the opening of the Vietnam peace talks and of the assassination of Martin Luther King. A bit later, when I was typing this text, this was in May, the universities of Paris were invaded by the forces of order, and for the first time, at the request of a rector, and then reoccupied by the students in the upheaval you are familiar with. this historical and political horizon would call for a long analysis. I've simply found it necessary to mark, date, and make it known to you the historical circumstances in which I prepared this communication, since these circumstances appear to me, and it's an important bit, to belong by all rights to the field and problematic of archaeology, which is the question where does France stand in relation to man. Derrida thus continues, thus the transition will be made quite naturally to the theme of this communication, where is France as concerns man. So the conjunctural meaning of humanism in 1968 for Derrida is quite clear. The conjuncture is decolonization and national liberation abroad, civil rights, particularly in the race context in the US, and new left political radicalization in Europe. So when Derrida, in his slightly arched, deconstructed way throughout the text, constantly refers to what he rather formally calls a certain outside of thought, the outside of thought that he's referring to are these historical political events which constitute the meaning of the question of the human in 1968. That which is outside of philosophy, outside of philosophical universalization of the human, is also, importantly, ironically, named the content of the so-called human sciences. So at this point in Derrida's thought, the content of the so-called human sciences and that which is conjuncturally outside the West, as he says at one point, are explicitly cross-coded. Now, the conjuncture within the French Communist Party, depending on Althusser's concerns, appears decidedly parochial by comparison with this. Despite the residual internationalism, or at least the rhetorical internationalism, of the international communist movement in the 60s, the fact that Althusser's main interlocutor in his essays on self-communism, on self-criticism, will be the obscure British communist John Lewis, who exists in historical memory of everyone but his mother, only as the man to whom Althusser replied, tells you something about the global character debates within the Communist Party at that time. This is the moment of the philosophical registration of difference as the echo of the imposition of geopolitical difference. Obviously, it's Algeria in France, and of course it was initially registered within structuralism, and this is important in an anthropological form in Levi-Strauss's ethnology. And one of the interesting things about the history of structuralism is precisely that structuralism begins by registering that which will destroy the concept of the human only within anthropology as a discipline, as the discipline through which that which the anthropological concept will be destroyed is registered. It's the homogenization of the conceptual space of European philosophy by what Derrida called Kojeve's anthropologistic readings of Hegel, Heidegger, and Husserl, condensed in the French context into Sartre's famous mistranslation of Dasein as human reality. These were the conditions that made anti-humanism possible. In other words, theoretical anti-humanism is understood here by me as the structuralist recoding of Heidegger's failed ontological critique of humanism as metaphysics. So structuralism, if you like, completes the failed task of the Heideggerian critique of humanism. As Derrida puts it, and this is another quote from the Derrida essay, quote, the anthropologistic reading of Hegel, Husserl, and Heidegger was a mistake in one entire respect. Perhaps it was the most serious mistake. And it is this reading, this mistake, that furnished the best conceptual resources to post-war French thought. Okay. This, in a way, this is like the alternative story about Kojève to Boris's, which is that the historical role of Kojève is to have unified the field of modern European philosophy within the concept of man, such that it could be opposed and destroyed by anti-humanism. So that the historical function of Kojève was to make anti-humanism possible, and thereby his own thought redundant. other than ironically, in this late historicized post-human mode. So what's important, the anthropological reading Hegel, is important negatively because it produces its critique. The later thought, in some sense, survives the early thought because within its own historical terms, it's post-human in the humanist sense. As Derrida points out, and this is a good point actually that I think people are confused about. Derrida is quite explicit about this. It is not the philosophical critique of the so-called human sciences that gave rise to anti-humanism. Okay? Rather, it is the reverse. This is the quote. It is the dominating and spellbinding extension of the human sciences within the philosophical field, unquote, that gave rise to anti-humanism. In other words, it's the extension of the outside within, not the extension of philosophy outwards. It's the dialectics of this extension of the outside within the philosophical field that leads us methodologically back to Marx because of the grounding of Marxist thought from 1945 onwards on a critique of the illusory self-sufficiency of philosophy as a discourse. And that takes us forward to a philosophical rereading of Capital from the standpoint of an understanding of the structural determination as part of a theory of the subject. So that's the reading of Capital that I'm going to just gesture towards in conclusion. For it is still in the 3 volumes of Capital, not volume 1. One of the problems with Capital is that as a book, despite the revival of readings of Capital since the crisis over the last 5 years, almost nobody reads Capital. Everybody reads volume 1. Right? This is like reading Hegel's logic and never going beyond becoming. Right? You can't read a systematic dialectical text and just read part 1. Because if you just read part 1, you don't know the philosophical meaning of part 1. Okay? So part 1 is constant and systematically misread because nobody reads volumes 2 and 3. This is a kind of weird thing. Right? I think someone would have done something about that. It's still the 3 volumes of Capital that offer the best way into the theorization of the production of the human, since it's the universalization of the relations of commodity production and exchange as the means for the accumulation of value. In other words, the system of global capital, that is the overwhelmingly dominant form of the social, globally and historically, and hence the overwhelmingly dominant form of the human today. The question of the human is really the question of what is a human subject of capitalist social relations? That is the current question of the human. Derrida ends his essay, The Three Ends of Man, with 3 what he calls general rubrics, which we can read successively as an account of the intellectual history of France from the mid-50s to the 60s, to the end of the 60s, and which are the stages in an argument of a whole generation in France that led from structuralism to Nietzsche. And the rubrics go like this. First, the reduction of meaning. The reduction of meaning, this is in contrast to the phenomenological and ontological reductions to meaning with which it's breaking. The reduction of meaning to some outside of meaning, which in the disciplinary intellectual context means some positivity or some disciplinary content. Okay? What that means, for example, is that it's only possible for Marx to philosophize via the critique of political economy, because you can't philosophize through self-sufficient discipline. You can only philosophize through the positivity of another discourse. All you can do is critique, reinterpret, and reconstruct other disciplinary knowledges. That's the function of philosophy after its critique. Secondly, it says we have a choice between 2 strategies, and this is the more disappointingly brilliant bit. We have a choice between 2 strategies of relating to the outside. He says, given the force and efficiency of the system that regularly changes every transgression into a false exit, taking account of these effects of the system, there is nothing from the inside where we are about the choice between two strategies. One, this is a quotation, to attempt an exit and a deconstruction without changing terrain. The problem there is that this risks what he calls sinking into the autism of closure, or to decide to change terrain in a discontinuous and interrupted fashion by brutally placing oneself outside by affirming absolute break and difference. Although he then says the simple fact of language will simply reinstate the new terrain on the oldest ground. So the choice is in fact not much of a choice at all. And Derrida wants rather disappointingly to interweave the two choices. Deconstruction, Derrida in a way, is simply moving between one and another of those two choices. But the final rubric that he offers us shows us where his desire actually is, namely on the side of the break, however it will be reinscribed, however phantasmatically absolute it is. Because the final rubric is the difference in Nietzsche between the superior man and the superman or the Übermensch, and the need not to confuse the two. The Übermensch is, of course, the man of the absolute break with philosophy and meaning alike. And among other things, it's that Nietzscheanism that gives rise to the nihilistic science of early speculative realism, just in ignorance of its own restatement on the oldest, reinstatement on the oldest ground, in Derrida's sense. It becomes just a classical mythological narrative of natural history. What's striking about this aphoretic conclusion to Derrida's essay is that Derrida neglects the possibility of giving any systemic social and historical content to the human today, from the standpoint of an open post-humanist displacement of problematic humanity. The first rubric, in other words, the reduction of meaning to an outside associated with the so-called human sciences, is effectively discarded, even though that's the intellectual driver of the process of the intellectual history that took place. So that's the limit of deconstruction as itself a wholly philosophical enterprise. In Capital, on the other hand, we have something more interesting, which is we have the idea of a unified human science, first formulated by Marx in his early humanist work, finding its post-humanist actualization via the critique of political economy, in a theoretically and radically novel discourse in which the conceptual space of philosophical categories is occupied in concretely historical structural forms at multiple levels and different and disjunctive levels of abstraction. In particular, the systemic account of the value form as a social form, effects form analysis of the constituent elements of the capitalist mode of production, which goes on all the way to the end of volume 3, has what I want to call the periodicity of the historical ontology of the human, insofar as the practices in which it gives an account produce, reproduce, and transform a specifically capitalistic kind of human subject. In other words, modes of production, in their systemic, epochal, historical meaning, are periodizations of the human, they are ontological periodizations of the human. What this means is that one has to begin any debate about the human with the acknowledgement that we are all capitalistic subjects. We may be, if you like, outside the philosophical concept of the subject, but we are not outside the capitalistic practical form of the subject. And that rather changes the way you view questions about political transformation once you acknowledge that your we is essentially a part of variable capital. So what I would do, which I'm not going to do here because it would take a book, which I will do as a book, would be to produce a reading of Capital where you account for the structural components of the production of the human through the social categories of the book. So I'm just going to give you just one page to finish to give you an example of the way such a reading would go. And the first is about method, and the second is about complexity. The methodological point is that there's an ontological primacy to the categories of time and life in Capital, insofar as one aspect of what retrospectively appears as two basic constituent arguments of the modern European philosophical tradition can be maintained. I'm not going to talk about this here, but I take them as premises. One is the temporalization and subjectivation, or the production of the human. Temporalization and subjectivation are a single coterminous process. And the second is the more, the point that appears in Hegelian or Heideggerian forms in different ways, that human life has meaning relative to experiences of time that are constituted by death as their limit, however you construe the character and the function of death in that constitution. Life is a category that spans the human and the non-human, but its indifference to that distinction is not a matter of indifference to humans. So methodologically, this leads to a reading of Capital that proceeds from the extraction and the systematic reconstruction of temporal and life concepts, not only in well-known primary instances, which is what we find in a standard literature, like time as the measure of value, living labour versus variable capital versus dead labour of constant capital, the repetition of the machine, the periodicities of circulation and reproduction, etc. All of which are the temporal modes to which we are subjected and through which we are constituted as subjects, as capitalistic subjects of social exchange. But also a reconstruction of temporal concepts that moves to a much lower level of philological detail in the text, that, if you like, draws out those things. I'm going to end now. I'm going to end with I'll end with just a list of some of the categories. This is, in a way, this is vacated. This is the Dal 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 sound poem rendering of the temporal categories of the capital for you, right? So if you just start to recap in this way, which I was doing with my students in Paris this year, we came up initially with a shortened list of 33 temporal categories, right? Which are succession, continuity, flow, flux, movement, process, development, progression, regression, interval, duration, revolutionization, coexistence, repetition, cycle, circulation, circuit, period, turnover, reflux, renewal, anticipation, return, interruption, standstill, crisis, destruction, delay, speed, stagnation, eruption, explosion, disruption. If you read Capital from the standpoint of temporal categories, that would, I think, be the minimum 33 categories that you would need to find a theoretical articulation of relative to processes of subjectivation to give any minimal preliminary account of the production of the human subject through its temporalization by capital. So the human is spread across the complex and contradictory articulation of these forms, which offer a structural framework for accounting for the ongoing production of the human through and in relation to the alienated powers of the human in capital. Just to return finally to my point about what is the conjunction of post-89, in its spatial aspect, that's to say global political economy, this analysis rejoins the geopolitical dimension of Derrida's introduction of the concept of the outside, namely the question of the geopolitical meaning of the debate about what we might call the production of humanity after 1989, or, as it says on the banner on the Polish embassy up the road, 25 years of freedom. I take this to be an ironic statement, objectively speaking. This is the context in which the West is shedding the last vestiges of its geographical meaning to become the signifier not of capital as such, as one might think, but rather of an at least ideologically very particularly political form of capitalism, a context in which the ideological meaning of the outside is shifting, but in which the outside, however much its boundary shifts, can no longer be considered outside to the human. It's because the outside can can no longer be considered outside to the human, that if you like, it has become intensified as a political threat. So terms like the terrorist, for example, which is one of the current names for the outside, is particularly threatening in a post-humanist context, because you can't in some sense deny the terrorists their humanity. If the inside-outside division becomes internal to the human, then the purely political character of the division can no longer be concealed. And that is, if you like, the political productivity of post-humanism.
Thank you very much. I think we can take, if you like, 2-3 questions, and then maybe we can have another 2-3 questions for general discussion. Maybe address your question.
Thanks, Peter. I have a question about dates. And some people in the audience will be surprised. So, the Jean-Luc Nancy book, What Comes After the Subject, was who comes after what, not who. Right.
No, who, not what?
Yes, who comes after the subject. Well, that's already a bit of a cheeky one. So that project was started in '89, you said?
No, it was first published, first set of essays were published in '89.
Oh, okay.
The question, I think he formulated the question in '87.
Right, okay. So, but first published in '89, and then there was a second installment in '91.
Well, what happened is that when they redo the special issue of the journal as a book, they add more, they ask an additional number of famous people in order to sell the book.
So very fortuitous and very...
91. So it comes right at the moment at the beginning of my, it bridges the moment at the beginning of my geopolitical realization.
Right, okay. So, well, I have a question about periodization in that regard, and it has to do with the continued distinction between the human and humanism, humanity and humanism. And actually, a third term that I thought would be helpful to bring in is that of the humanitarian and humanitarianism, which, of course, I think is a very important, which marks a very important shift in the French philosophical scene of the late 70s and early 80s. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the political conditions of that. And just,
But that's part of the return of humanism, right? This is what Nancy is worried about. This is on the philosophical back of, to have a massive invasion, because it's essentially the return to Kant, basically a Kantian concept of humanism as the basis for a concept, as a philosophical basis for the concept of human rights. Right? So what people, there's a dual conjunction here in a way. There's the right-wing ex-Maoists, or if you like, getting on board a UN discourse, and now the right, in a different sense, in the sense of the benevolent thinking liberals, for whom, if you like, humanism appears to be the only philosophical justification for human rights. This is what people worry about, right? In a way, the most pernicious political trick in France in the course of the 70s and early 80s was to try to associate theoretical anti-humanism with late Maoism. And obviously Badiou embodied these two positions within himself. So in a way, he allowed for this conflation, in some sense, to take place. So that, like, theoretical anti-humanism could be blamed, for the Khmer Rouge and stuff like this. That was the character of the French debate in the early 80s. I want to stick with this idea that you've got to separate the human from humanism and reground these discourses in a non-metaphysical way. Because when you ground them in a metaphysical way, they simply become incoherent and inconsistent. Right? Because it doesn't matter how many declarations of human rights you have or how good your constitution is. No one is being treated according to these rights of the constitution. It's completely irrelevant now. So the threat to the concept of human rights that is allegedly produced by theoretical anti-humanism, especially I think theoretically non-existent, but it's also politically specious, right? Because the people who uphold the concept of human rights are not universal, such as the UN, for example, are not universally applying these categories. Because if you apply the categories, you have to abolish capitalism for a start, right? So it's too big a task. So they have another function.